I'm Naomi Azar. I am the project director, associate director of the New England Coalition Against Trafficking. And we're going to be speaking today about the subject of understanding what trauma is, understanding what trauma informed care really means, and how we can apply it to ourselves and how we can apply it to our work. So before I get started, I just want to take a moment, ask folks to mute their microphones if you haven't already. I'm also going to ask you guys to just send me a quick note in your chat box. Let me know if you're hearing me okay and if there's any issues so far with audio that I need to be aware of before we get started. Okay, sounds good. People are saying we're all set. Fantastic. Hi, Hannah. How are you? All right, so let's jump in. Um, I will just mention also, I'm going to be joined by our data manager, and I'm going to give a second to explain what we are, who NECAT really is. So Alyssa Brailsford is going to jump in at times, and we're going to share this talk. And if you have further questions, if you'd like the PDF afterwards, we will certainly provide all of that to all of the folks who have signed up. So let me just take a moment and explain NECAT, the New England Coalition Against Trafficking. We are a federally funded project, and we have representatives across all of New England who are actively working to combat human trafficking in their respective states. We focus a great deal on providing training to various types of agencies with the intention of increasing the capacity to screen and identify potential victims of human trafficking and to connect them with resources if that's what they choose. Um, One big piece of what we're trying to do with this project is to connect with agencies that we're calling unconventional, which means those are agencies that don't typically provide health and human services. However, in the course of their everyday work, due to the type of work they do, might be likely to encounter potential victims of trafficking. And I say all that to you, all of you who are on the call, because I realize some of you might have ideas about that, might have some interesting connections about that. Those types of agencies might be meter readers, electricians, plumbers, delivery drivers. Recently, we've been working with a group that empowers nannies and au pairs in Massachusetts. So we're looking for folks who are likely to come into contact with individuals in residences or work sites. And if you have ideas or connections that you'd like to share with us, we would be thrilled to be in touch with you directly. We also do direct outreach, and we do various types of public awareness events. What you guys are participating in today is part of our advanced learning series. This is the second webinar that we are putting out, and recently we had one by Julie Dahlstrom, who is a lawyer working with an immigration lawyer working at Boston University. If you're interested in checking out her talk that aired in August, we'd be happy, sorry, in end of July, early August, we'd be happy to share it with you, and it's related to the T visa process and the U visa process for foreign nationals who are here on account of trafficking. So we'd love to share that with anyone who's interested. All right. So if you have questions as we go, feel free to send a note in the chat box. Someone asks, oh, how do I mute? So we got an answer. Thank you, Alyssa. And we will take some time for questions towards the end, but if we see something that we can address in the middle, then we will do that as well. All right, so let's just orient ourselves to understanding what trauma really is. Some of you guys might be familiar with this text put out by Judith Herman in her book, Trauma and Recovery. I want to just highlight the very bottom part. Traumatic events are extraordinary, not because they occur rarely, but because they overwhelm the ordinary human adaptations to life. So we are all hardwired to adapt to challenging situations. But what happens when our capacity to adapt is actually overwhelmed, when we can't get out of a situation using our natural defense system? Much of what we talk about with trauma-informed care is going to touch on this issue of becoming overwhelmed and how we address overwhelm, and also how we think about preventing overwhelm in the people that we work with. So understandably, if we think about a child, let's say getting dropped off at preschool, That parent might give the kid a kiss, a hug. They walk out the door, and I'm sure many of you who have kids have had this experience, this painful cry, the child being left in the classroom. Sorry, someone just joined on, and if you could mute your phone, that'd be great. Thank you. Um, the sound of the crying, right? That stressful experience of hearing your child wanting you to come back, the tears, the big shriek, that can be overwhelming in the moment. But often in the presence of another caring adult, and this is that kid. Sorry, I meant to flip to this sooner, but think about this kid, right? This scream. But in the presence of other caring adults, engaging activities, a reminder that the parent is going to come back, then the child starts to settle. Um, we consider this kind of stressful experience as sort of tolerable. So we all go through various types of temporary stressors, but when we are supported by responsive caregivers or responsive others, there is a way in which that stress is buffered. And in many ways, that stress is very valuable. We can't really operate without experiencing stress and being able to almost inoculate ourselves to future stress by learning how to respond to it early on. But we know that when stress is prolonged over a course of time, and when we don't actually have a protective relationship to buffer that stress, then the stress levels in the system can become toxic. And the impact of that toxicity um, prevents us from having that sort of calm approach to a situation, right? In the state of toxic stress, we know that the system doesn't experience the ability to pick up on cues in a non threatening or non defensive way. Instead, we start to adjust ourselves, anticipating an environment that's going to be threatening in some way. So while in the first example, the child does recover, finds that they're able to feel regulated again and can enjoy themselves, can focus on play. In other situations, we can feel completely overwhelmed. And I'm just using the image of the border as a reminder for all of us of some of the recent imagery that we've had to come into contact with about the terrible stress experienced by children who are separated from parents at the border. And this would be considered a toxic level of stress. It's overwhelming the normal human adaptations. So our brain is hardwired for survival. Somebody needs to mute their phone if you don't mind. Thank you. Um, we have a very complex brain that knows what to do if it anticipates threat. In this very basic visual, we can see the red part is sort of the deepest part of our brain that really controls our basic functions like breathing and heart rate and food, being hungry, being tired. And all of that is sort of the deeper levels of regulation in our system. Above that, we look at the limbic system, which by and large is the part of our brain that's responsible for our automatic stress response. When we perceive some kind of threat in our environment, we have to respond quickly. And our bodies really just respond before we're even aware that we're responding. We look to either fight off the threat or to run away from whatever the threat might be. And in order to do this, our brain has to kind of say, hey, there's a danger here, and then start secreting a range of stress hormones that allows us to act. And these are responses that are familiar, I'm sure, to many of you, both in your own life. If you picture, standing at the street and seeing a bus come by and you're just right at the edge of the curb, and that sensation of, oh my God, I have to move out of the way, your body is responding quicker than your thoughts can process what's happening. And so you're ready to go and you actually do mobilize your body to move. Thankfully, our stress hormones allow us to do that without having to take the time to figure out that we're too close to the curb and the bus is about to hit us. And this is important because, like I said, it activates a response that is really an automatic response. So we could either engage in fighting, and that's, of course, when a threat has the ability to be conquered. That might be our automatic response. If we perceive that we can avoid the threat, then our automatic response might be to flee a situation. That might be to, in some cases, dissociation is on this list. Um, Dissociation is more complicated than just sort of fleeing, like running away. Dissociation can sometimes come up when you actually can't leave the situation, but you know you can't physically tolerate the experience that you're having. And so dissociation is actually a part of our response system that allows us to separate ourselves from the experience and in many cases not actually code into our memory storage what is happening to us in the moment. When a threat can be mitigated, we try to actually give in sometimes to submit. And that in some cases can actually look like just going um, limp, allowing yourself to appear like you're frozen or that, sorry, there's some talking happening if you don't mind muting. Um, we have all of these available to us and we go into them automatically.
Oh, yeah, thank you for putting it there. I saw it. Miriam's cutting it right now.
If you can hear me and your mute isn't on, if you could please put it on, that would be helpful. Thank you. So we know that we have all of these different responses, and I'm just giving this a really brief overview. There's so much more we could get into about the physiology of trauma and about how our brains help us to respond to trauma. But the main point is that we do it automatically. We do it based on what's available to us, what's most likely to work in the moment. So when you think about the individuals that you work with, many of you are familiar with the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. We understand that there's a lot of adversity that a lot of people face early in their life. And we just want to think about how many types of different kinds of adversities are common amongst the folks that you're working with. These are the 10 ACEs, they're called, that are frequently noted and are linked to challenges in terms of psychological and medical outcomes. And the understanding is that this high level of stress in the system is having a long-term impact on our brain's development and on our body's responses. Understandably, we have to be hardwired to be more responsive to threat if we're growing up in an environment that has a lot of hostility. So there's various types of abuse, various types of neglect, and of household dysfunction that can all contribute to high levels of stress in the system. And importantly, we want to think about the impact of that early stress, of that trauma, really, the prolonged experience of stress in the context of no real relief or no supportive other figures who can buffer that experience. We want to think about the impact on behavior and on physical and mental health. Many of you who are familiar with the ACEs study and those who are not might remember and find it interesting to consider that there's an association, a direct association between the number of early adversities from this list of 10 and the link between an increased risk for those types of negative physical and mental health outcomes. Some of them are listed here in this chart. I also want to highlight that there are now understood to be sensitive periods of development in which the brain is more likely to respond to high levels of stress, and that would be in preschool and in adolescence. And so what we know about what goes on when there's high levels of stress early in life, the brain is going to start to adjust for that perception of a hostile environment. It's going to start to pick up on cues in the environment that's going to trigger that stress response, the flooding of hormones, the quick action into a defense response, whether that's fighting, fleeing, submitting. There's even more that we're not going to get into right now. We know that all of that basically constitutes a form of becoming dysregulated. When you're in the context of the stressor, that's actually really useful, right? You want to be at the ready, you want to be responsive, or you want to be shut down so as not to draw attention. But when you're no longer in the stressful situation, becoming dysregulated can be challenging for an individual, can be challenging for an environment that's working with the individual, can be challenging for relationships. Basically, in any number of categories, dysregulation can cause some difficulty. This little overview is just an image of what we're talking about when we think about dysregulation. We're thinking about what happens when a person becomes so overwhelmed by some emotion that they have to either go into a shutdown, if you go down into the yellow, where they stop feeling motivated, they stop feeling concerned about their environment, or they become overwhelmed to the point where they're unable to use our frontal lobe, the part of our brain that helps us think about cause and effect, the part of our brain that helps us think about the impact of our actions, and instead be in a heightened state of arousal where we might be likely to act in ways that are impulsive, that are highly reactive to our environment or into other people, without the ability to put the situation into some perspective. Um, so we're going to touch on how this all fits into what we're calling the window of tolerance. Um, the window of tolerance is a way of thinking about this idea of dysregulation. We all, if you picture yourself in the course of your day, and you picture the squiggly line being you and your energy level and your emotional state, when you're between the top line and the bottom line, one is considered to be within their window, which really means that's when you're able to handle incoming stress, you're able to respond to it in a somewhat productive way, and you're not too thrown. You're still able to use logic and reasoning to navigate a situation. So, for instance, you wake up and your toddler and you are having breakfast and they spill milk all over the floor. On one morning, that might be totally okay, and you just get a sponge and you wipe it up, and that would be considered to be within your window in that moment. But let's imagine that you had a terrible night's sleep. Let's imagine that you have something looming, either something at work or something in your personal life that's really on your mind. Let's imagine you're feeling really burnt out overall, and your toddler spills the milk, and all of a sudden, you're already kind of at the top edge or at the bottom edge of your window, and that spilled milk is the thing that sets you out of your window. And you shoot up. Maybe you become reactive. Maybe you yell. Maybe you stomp around. Maybe you close, yourself off in the bathroom and slam the door. Or maybe you just kind of go into a shutdown. You can't clean up the spilled milk. You sit there and you just want to cry, or you just want to crawl right back into bed and not do anything to address the situation. So in those two examples, we see the pattern of becoming either hyper aroused, sort of shooting through that window at the top, or becoming hypo aroused. Some way of saying it is like going into the basement, right? Becoming completely shut off and withdrawn. And these are ways of responding that are typical. What's important to understand is that we all have different windows. Some of us have more narrow windows, some of us have wider windows. So for an individual who has a more narrow window, it's makes a lot of sense that it would take less to have that person experience a stressor that sort of goes beyond the threshold, and they go either above into a state of being hyper aroused or below into a state of being hypo aroused. There is an understanding that oftentimes brains that are hardwired for survival due to high levels of early stress or due to experiences of chronic stress over other stretches of time in life, for instance, experiencing trafficking over the course of a long period of time, experiencing high levels of physical violence, feeling very frightened, that can start to narrow a person's tolerance for what they're able to tolerate, and that might mean lesser ability to stay regulated. When we're talking about hyperarousal, we're talking about reactions such as becoming highly anxious, becoming overwhelmed, becoming aggressive, fidgety, hyperactive. Sorry, I'm just clicking, but some of them aren't coming up yet. Becoming enraged, experiencing heart racing, fast breathing or shallow breath and fast breathing, sweating. These are all responses from the sympathetic nervous system that are getting the body going. In the case of being hypoaroused, we might think about no real visual displays of emotion, becoming really shut down, experiencing some loss of memory, feeling disconnected or showing a sort of disconnect. If you've ever sat with somebody, they might be internally having their heart racing, but they appear to you to be completely cut off. That can be an indication of hypoarousal. having, again, shallow or fast breathing, but that might be imperceptible to the provider sitting with them, difficulty speaking. And these fluctuations can happen momentarily. I'm sure if you think about some of the work you do, you've had an experience where you're talking to someone and you're feeling like there is a back and forth, and you're feeling like things are comfortable and there's some rapport between the two of you. And then you ask a question or shift your body a certain way, or you're not even sure kind of what the precipitating factor was, but suddenly something has shifted in the dynamic and you sense that they've either become hyper aroused or hypo aroused. Um, and that usually is an indication that there is some sort of trigger that has occurred. So I'm going to pause here for a moment. And if anyone has any questions you want to type into the chat box here, or if you want to unmute yourself, we can take a question or two before Alyssa starts the next section. All right, it seems like no one has any questions, so I'm going to go ahead and continue. And I'm just going to skip through this part because we already talked about it. All right, so we're going to take a deeper look at all of this and see how kind of unpack what Naomi was just talking about a little bit more. So we believe that trauma impacts kind of core areas for people, and I'm going to go over a few of them. And what I'm about to talk about actually comes from a PDF that was developed at the Trauma Center that we can send out at the end of this webinar. But one of the areas that's affected is regulation of affect and impulses. So what does that mean and what does that look like? You might see folks who have a hard time managing their emotions, their behaviors, or their physiology, so their like arousal level or energy level, which Naomi was just speaking to with the window of tolerance. And what that might look like with folks in front of you might be someone who seems maybe a bit frozen or shut down or spacey. You might see someone who is having a hard time sitting still. They might be jumpy, maybe some like anger or hostile behavior, or perhaps maybe a little bit weepy. And an example of this could be, if a person is sitting with a lead prosecutor in their case and you're reviewing content in the affidavit and the person appears engaged or disengaged, and then you think maybe they're not paying attention, and then all of a sudden the person just jumps up and tells you, "You're not listening to me," and they burst into tears, and the persecutor tries to then talk to them and engage them, but they're still kind of like then frozen and shut down and can't respond. So I'm not sure if folks are familiar with maybe an experience like this, and we want to provide some tips for what we can do in those moments. So one key tip is to not take reactions too personally, and being aware of managing your own emotional responses in these kind of encounters. Something else that could be helpful is offering people frequent breaks, especially if someone's having to engage in a task that might induce a strong emotion. And also being aware of the person sitting in front of you and noticing if they're seeming maybe shut down or disconnected, and it might be a sign for us that the person is overwhelmed. So it would be good to provide specific supports or resources in those moments, and maybe materials that are helpful to support people's regulation. So that might mean having silly putty or a stress ball available, maybe having soft lighting or a calm environment. And another core area of focus of impact would be on attention and on consciousness. So what that means might be difficulty integrating an experience. That could look like memory gaps for people. You could maybe see some changes in folks' narrative. So maybe one time you meet with them and they tell you something about their story or their life, and the next time they meet with you, they're maybe not remembering different aspects, or they don't remember telling you. And maybe you might see someone dissociating or disconnecting from different aspects of the experience that they had.
And this is a way to just manage overwhelming feelings, thoughts, and events that have happened. So, what that might look like is someone, again, seeming maybe frozen or shut down. Like I mentioned, maybe some gaps in memory or changes in a verbal narrative. Someone's presentation also might change. So, maybe one day you're meeting with someone and they're seeming calm, and regulated, and then you might meet with them in a different space or on another day, and maybe that presentation changes, and maybe the person is more, angry or upset or having different outbursts, and it might be kind of confusing when you're getting these different presentations. And another way this might show up could be emotions not matching the story. So if maybe someone's telling you a story that you think they should be feeling sad about, but you see the person with like a really limited affect, or maybe the person is laughing, and it can be kind of confusing. So again, this is because of the way that that trauma could impact the way someone's integrating their experience or their attention or consciousness. So what to do when we're confronted with this kind of situation? One tip is to check in to make sure that the person is really hearing you and understanding you. Sometimes people might look like they're really with us and listening to us, but might actually be feeling kind of spacey. So regularly checking in with people is helpful. Also, having written information can be helpful for clients so that they're getting the info in a different way that's not just verbal. And it's also important to remember that changes in memory don't necessarily indicate a falsehood, but it might be just evidence of a trauma response that the person is having. Also, it could be helpful to try to hold conversations when the person's feeling safe or in an environment where they're feeling safe. And then again, like I mentioned before, offering self-soothing materials and breaks to people is helpful.
Okay.
And the last area of impact that I'm going to talk about, there's of course more, but just for time's sake, the next one we'll talk about is impact on relationships. And what that means is the impact on folks' ability to trust. If you have your phone on, if you could just put it on mute, please. Thank you. So that could impact the individual's ability to form a trusting relationship with someone. So that could be you as the provider, and then also relationships with other people. And what that looks like is vulnerable. Sorry. Okay, so that could be vulnerability to ongoing victimization with people. It could mean pulling back from offered supports because it's really hard to trust, and maybe the relationship the person is having with a provider might remind them in some ways of other relationships where they were exploited, or they might have put trust in someone and then were exploited because of that. And so the relationship itself becomes a trigger, and someone might pull back from support that's being offered. So, yeah, so we have a question here in the chat box from Hannah, and she's saying, in research interviews of participants with trauma, I've had also that depending on what is, I've heard also that depending on what is shared about different time points in their life, their personality has changed, including accent, voice tone. Have you seen that also? So I think that's an awesome question, and we could dedicate a lot of time to it. What I would say briefly about it now is it sounds a lot like dissociation, and that folks can kind of, during a traumatic experience, if it happened early on, dissociate and have like a different part of them that develops in that moment and might have, an accent or just a different kind of personality. So I think that's an aspect of dissociation that's really interesting. And I wish we had more time to talk about it, but maybe in the end we can address it further if we have more time. So thank you for that question. Okay, so in terms of tips of what we can do if someone's having a hard time, maybe in a relationship with you as a provider or someone else, some sorry, if you're on a phone, if you could just mute it, that would be great. So I don't have the tips up on the slide, unfortunately, but we can share that with you after the webinar. But if you are engaging with someone, again, don't take it personally if someone is seeming distrustful of you, And our goal would really be to provide a safe enough environment for folks. Yeah, sorry, I don't have that in here. Some other safety features would be if you're in a meeting room, making sure that the area is maybe well lighted, knowing where the person maybe wants to sit in the room and not blocking them in, providing the person some control in the situation is also really important. And yeah, I think that's good. Also knowing that it's good for us to reach out to victims or survivors as opposed to just waiting for them to reach out to us, but for us to initiate some of that contact. So when the provider becomes dysregulated. So I think when we're speaking of dysregulation, it's really important to note that it shows up in all of us. So it shows up in clients or consumers that we're working with, but it also shows up in us as providers and as people. So it's really essential to build our own self-awareness to better serve our clients and to take care of ourselves. So with that, I wanted to actually share an experience that I had. And this was my first year out of grad school, and I was working at a community-based organization, and we provided like outpatient level of care for therapy, but we provided it in folks' homes. And so I was assigned a client, and I was told that she was a survivor of human trafficking. And sorry, if you're on a phone, if you could just mute it. Sorry about that. Okay, thank you. So I was assigned a new client who was a survivor of human trafficking, and she had been living in a program after she had exited the trafficking situation, and she was now going to be reunited with her family. And there was a lot of concern and tension with that. Her family did know that she had been trafficked and understood the trauma responses, but had young kids in the home, and they were quite nervous about their daughter returning to their house being so dysregulated. So there was a lot of tension going on there. And this client, we're going to call her Chrissy. She was about 17 years old when I was working with her and had been trafficked when she was 12. So I'm in my car, I'm on my way to her house, and I'm feeling myself like really eager and really excited to help her and to build this therapeutic relationship. And I go up and I knock on the door, and I met with this small child, and I asked for Chrissy, and she tells me, oh, she's in her room. And so I'm walking around this house that seems to have a lot of stuff all over the place and kids, and I enter this teenager's room, and I find her yelling at her younger sibling, and I'm starting to notice that this, excitement and eagerness and maybe this naive sense and maybe even wanting to rescue someone started to drift away a little bit. And instead, I was noticing like this grip of fear kind of wash over me. So I walk into her room, and her back is towards me. She's sitting on the ground, and she's looking kind of frozen, not moving much, and definitely sending me a pretty clear message that it was going to be hard to talk and hard to trust me in that moment. And so I walk in and probably nervously introduce myself and say, hi, I'm Alyssa. And she doesn't respond, she doesn't move, and I feel my heart beat faster and faster. I start to notice that my body is getting really warm, and I notice my mind get really, really busy. And I'm thinking, what do I do? What do I say? Do I leave? She's just sitting here. And so I asked if I could sit with her, and she just kind of shrugged her shoulders. So I kept a distance and sat on the ground. And I started to think, oh, great, like I have paperwork. I'll just, engage in the paperwork with her. And I thought that was going to rescue me, and thought maybe we don't really need to interact that much, and I can just do this paperwork with her. So I start explaining and talking and talking and talking and talking about the paperwork, and she is shutting down and shutting down and shutting down. And I again notice running through my mind is, oh, I'm really bad at this. what's she going to tell, the other workers? She's never going to want to meet with me again. And I'm totally not paying attention to her and very much centered on what's going on in my own mind. And to kind of jump a little bit, I would just say if I'm looking back on that session, it was filled with a lot of silence and probably a lot of misattunement. And I definitely was aware of my own dysregulation in that moment and nervousness, but I don't think I really knew what it meant or what to do with it. I think in some ways I was trying to avoid it and pretend that it wasn't there and hope that she wouldn't notice. And I'm sure that she probably did notice. So what does this mean? I think that it's really important that we break this down a little bit and talk about what dysregulation looks like in us and what can we do about it so that we can better serve our clients. So how do you know when you're becoming dysregulated? Again, I would offer people, if they want, to use the chat box here and think about ways that you know that dysregulation is showing up for you, and I can definitely share some of those responses with folks. So one way that we know we're becoming dysregulated is that there's an impact on our thinking and on our decision making. So that might look like having difficulty thinking straight. So like I mentioned, maybe having too many thoughts or no thoughts, or maybe your words get kind of jumbled and you misspeak. Choosing to intervene or speaking to a client in a way that you wouldn't typically do. So an example of that might be, you're working in a residential setting and somebody comes in and they ask you to print something, and all of a sudden you just snap at them and you're like, you can't demand this of me. You can't come in here and ask for this. And you realize, like, why did I just snap at that person or talk to them in that way? Another example could be maybe doing an intervention you wouldn't typically do. So perhaps you're working with a survivor and they need a ride somewhere and you're really worried about their safety, taking public transportation. And so you decide maybe you can just drive them in your car, even though that's something you wouldn't typically do. So that would be kind of feeling dysregulated and using a way of rescuing to try to help someone when you know you wouldn't typically do something like that. And then also noticing your own fight, flight, or freeze response. So you might see a client and sense yourself already ready to kind of argue or defend yourself. Maybe you want to run the other direction. Or maybe you just feel stuck and you're not really sure what you're going to say or what you need to do. Another way that this shows up is willingness to engage with a client. So maybe you're noticing an aversion to someone that you're working with, and that could show up in those times that we might feel relieved if someone cancels on us and we don't have a session or a meeting with that person, or you start to notice this like dread come up as you know you're about to meet with someone. It could also mean that you start to shut down because of internal distress that you're experiencing that maybe you want to avoid or ignore because you don't want to face or deal with what's coming up for you in relation to this other person. Another way that it can show up is managing your own, or something we can do is to manage our own feelings of overwhelm and helplessness. So once you're noticing that you're feeling dysregulated or helpless, maybe you can engage in something that will bring you back to your body and back to feeling centered. So one example of that could be practicing some grounding skills. And I would invite you to even practice this right now. So some examples of grounding skills could be just noticing your feet on the ground and noticing what happens as you feel your feet on the ground. Maybe you can feel the texture of your socks or your shoes. Maybe you notice your back in your chair. Maybe you can even press a little bit hard your back into your chair. Perhaps you look around and notice 2 or 3 things that you see or that you hear. Maybe you notice your breath. I know in my practice and my work with folks, I have my go-to grounding techniques now so that I know when I'm feeling a little bit dysregulated, what can I do that will help me feel grounded and be able to be more embodied and present with the person. And I think having a plan and knowledge of what grounds you beforehand, or even doing some grounding work before walking into a session, can be really helpful to help us be present. Another way of managing your overwhelm or dysregulation could be some positive self-talk, and maybe separating from the part of you that's feeling a little bit down or a little bit worried, just a little bit, so that you can remind yourself that you're capable and you're able to do this. And another piece with that too is trying to be compassionate. I think that this work is really hard and it's easy to judge ourselves or to think that we're a bad person because we're having some kind of negative reaction or maybe even negative thought about a person, and to just give ourselves permission to acknowledge that this is hard work and have compassion for ourselves is really important. Finally, I think it's essential to have a community that you can share your experience with. So maybe that's a supervisor or some coworkers, but this work is really hard and being alone in it, I think, makes it even more challenging. But having a community to share both hard things and celebrations is really important. All right. And again, we would invite you to send questions or any comments in the chat box, and Naomi is going to step back in.
All right. So we've talked about what trauma is. We've talked about what dysregulation is and how an individual that we work with who might have recently experienced trauma, who might have also in the past, in their early life, experienced trauma. In any of those examples, again, just understanding that there's a good chance that the brain is going to be doing its due diligence to pick up on cues in the environment that might make that person go into their typical survival response, whatever that typical response for that individual might be. Similarly, we all have our own typical responses, right? So it's just important to note here that up until this point, we're just trying to focus on the mutual regulation or dysregulation that can occur. And our environment and our language, all of the ways in which we operate tend to either help us feel more safe or less safe, give us information that we're doing okay, that we're not doing okay. Similarly, the environment that we're in can communicate that to the individual who's walking in those doors. So what does a client-centered, trauma-informed approach really mean, considering this backdrop of thinking about regulation? Well, there certainly is ways in which what we say and how we say it, and all of the processes that involve speech can be trauma informed. And what we mean by trauma informed really is that we're promoting a sense of regulation. And another way of saying that is that we're promoting a felt sense of safety. Some of these things can be really clearly defined by an agency or even by yourself as a professional. And so you might be thinking about all the ways in which you interact with somebody where the verbal choices you're making could convey a sense of safety with some greater intentionality. There's a whole process of scheduling, right? Scheduling that first conversation or that first intake. Thinking about the choice involved there. Is this person choosing to come in? Are they being referred? How might you verbally communicate in a way to the person that allows them to have the empowerment to choose to be coming in for an intake to talk with you? And these are going to just be broad overviews, and then we'll get into some specifics. With the intake process itself, thinking about the questions that are actually being asked, the terms you're using, what kinds of commitments you might be making. Again, this is all verbally mediated information. So we want to be holding in mind that all of that really matters. All of that is conveying whether or not this is a place that a person can feel a sense of trust with, and also whether you're a person they can feel trust with. And then the referral process. If you are working with someone, you conduct an interview, or maybe you're doing therapy and you're looking for some additional types of work the person can engage in. How are you going about talking about that referral process? Is there an assumption being made? Is there a request being put out by that individual? Again, this is all kind of headlines with lots of details underneath that we'll talk a little bit more about. Then in the way of thinking about regulation that is nonverbal in nature, right? We have so many ways in which the environment is telling us what we can expect and how we can feel. So we might want to think about the overall physical environment, like what happens when you walk into the office space itself, what is seen, what is on the wall, what is on the table, what is on the desk, even in a waiting room, what does that look like? And we'll talk more about the details of that. But then inside the office itself, there's a lot of other ways in which we're talking without using our words. How close are we sitting to the person we're talking with? What clothing are we wearing? What is the lighting in the space? Is it natural light? Is it not natural light? And then also in terms of the nonverbal piece, to what extent is an individual aware of their own biases and their own assumptions that could pop up in the course of their intake process or in the course of therapy with another individual? And can you notice how those biases impact your body language or your facial expression or even the tone of your voice? And then an awareness of how the dynamics of privilege and power really come into that encounter. Again, this could be a phone call, this could be a in-person intake, this could be ongoing therapy. That dynamic is very powerful, and it's really kind of go into the verbal category because we can name that with an individual. But whether one chooses to or not is really vital in establishing that sense of safety in the environment. Just going a little bit more concretely into the verbal side of things, one thing to think about is how you explain your relationship to law enforcement, and how important it is to really distinguish who you are from law enforcement. Oftentimes, there can be a lot of transference that is not linked to feeling safe, not linked to feeling trust, that comes with working with law enforcement and those types of interviews. And that is something I think a lot of people are actively working to get better at, working to rectify. But in the meantime, we want to always be able to give a person a sense of who they are really talking to. To what extent are you connected to law enforcement agencies? Verbally asking, are there any current safety concerns, is really vital, right? And having a plan in place in case there are current safety concerns. What would you do if the person says yes? How could you connect them to some larger resources in case they really don't want to or can't safely leave your office that day? Another valuable question that one could ask would be, have you spoken with a case manager before or with a therapist before? Really specific to the work that you're doing so that you can see what was it like for them the last time? What are they coming into the room holding as their expectation? It gives you some really critical information about the level of safety the person might be feeling as they walk in the door. And then, of course, this is something that gets said over and over again, but it's never enough. We only need a certain amount of information, especially when it comes to thinking about trafficking. We're thinking about force, fraud, and coercion with adults, with minors. We don't even need to think about those categories specifically. We're just thinking about any involvement in commercial sexual exploitation. Um, and so to be able to ask, first of all, do you feel okay sharing this with me? And checking back in throughout, especially if you notice any of those symptoms of hyperarousal or hypoarousal, being able to check in again. Is it still okay to share this with me? Maybe we could pause for a minute and take a break. Maybe you could squish on the stress ball, maybe get some water, any number of things that can bring us back into our window. But checking in a concrete way about whether it's okay to share with me. Um, and then regarding the verbal promises piece, noticing if you get dysregulated and you have this desire to make promises that you can't keep, and how often that might pop up for many individuals, sort of creating a overall distrust with the system, right? Like I was promised this by the last provider and they didn't deliver, so now how in the world am I supposed to trust that you're going to be able to give me the kind of support that I'm really looking for? So transparency in terms of what your part is and what you guys are really doing there today is really vital. And then another piece here is noting with the individual that there's a good chance they're going to feel some distress after the interview or after therapy or after talking about certain things, and thinking through with them, when you get that feeling or when you remember our conversation today, what do you imagine you're going to experience? And what will that do to you? Will it prevent you from concentrating? Will it make it hard to sleep tonight? Are there ways we can prep for that now while we're sitting here together? Is there a way that you could reassure them about their safety so that maybe some part of them will actually remind them later in the day that it was okay to have had that conversation? I asked all of our leads, we have state leads who represent NECAT across New England, to share some examples of their work. And so all of this is coming from their combined responses. But I'm going to share a quote here from Preble Street, which is located in Maine. Um, and this is a part of a document that they share with all of their employees. Whenever possible, interviews should always end in a positive manner. You should remind the interviewee how well he or she is managing and coping, and how sharing will not only help her or him, but may help others. So, thinking again about regulation and about safety, the difference of somebody leaving your space or leaving the interaction feeling uplifted, feeling like they're seen for their positive qualities and attributes, not only because of what happened to them, but because of who they are in a broader context, that's going to generate a much more likely to generate a sense of calm or a sense of hopefulness, a sense of security and trust than walking out of the room feeling badly about themselves. So even if you're talking about an actual trafficking narrative, thinking about where to put that narrative into the conversation and making sure you leave time at the end to step out of that to talk about other hobbies, interests, cultural expressions and identities, family connections, good friendships, etc., so that they can leave on a positive note. I want to point you towards the Arena Project. This is their website. They have a good listing of the kinds of verbiage and terms that carry various meanings. And I think, again, this is not new information, but it's sort of never enough in terms of how we go through a process of rigor internally, thinking about the terms that we're using and how they can communicate certain types of internal biases. So this is just a few of the items that they list on their site, but think about the terms you're using with that individual. Think about the terms that they are using to describe themselves and describe their own experiences, and how you might be able to use the terms that they're using so that they feel like they're really being understood by you and feel like it's safe to express themselves. So if you're interested in learning more, I would recommend going to their website and checking out their full list. They also give a little explanation for each term related to why they suggest using the recommended term, such as using victim or survivor of child sex abuse instead of a child prostitute or teen prostitute, etc. I want to move on to thinking about some of the nonverbal aspects of a communication that can communicate a sense of safety. Um, it's sort of a minor detail, but it can make a huge impact, which is incorporating living items such as plants, a fish tank, even just different natural materials like pine cones, other items, rocks, things that can be felt that convey a sense of groundedness, that also connect the space to the outside world. People typically do feel a little bit more calm when they're in nature. And so acknowledging that and bringing it into the space can be really useful. Thinking about color and textures and things that offer beauty in the space that create a bit of a homey quality, a less of a clinical quality, but much more of a comfort. And really asking them too, like, what is it in the space that works for you and that doesn't work for you? Sometimes in clinics, especially, there can be multiple rooms, and there might be a room that works better for a certain person, and seeing if you can accommodate them based on that need for feeling more secure and safe. Being aware of your body language, your tone, their tone of voice, having art, offering some beverages, offering healthy snacks, the idea of nourishment that gets communicated there, both about nourishing ourselves, nourishing others, creating a nurturing environment overall. And then thinking about your desk space, just jumping ahead. Oftentimes we all have so much that we're in the middle of, and so it's understandable we have a lot of stuff around us. But that really does communicate a sense of distraction. How might we organize ourselves so that when somebody's in our presence, we're really able to tune into them and they don't feel like they're just another thing on the to-do list? Rolling furniture is a nice idea related to being able to regulate how close or distant you are from another person. And thinking about the colors in the space. Are you using warm colors, cool colors, or neutral colors, and pairing of colors? So a lot of intentionality in the physical environment. I'm going to just borrow a quote now from the New Hampshire Human Trafficking Collaborative Task Force. This is another group that is a state lead with us with NECAT. And they're really talking about how they anticipate or address possible triggers. They anticipate that closed doors or open doors could be a trigger, that the seat positioning, the noise level, the cleanliness, odors, they try to keep snacks and drinks on hand. They conduct periodic check-ins over the course of the appointment, and they offer the client the opportunity to express any needs or concerns. That's really vital in terms of communicating a sense of empowerment, communicating a sense of choice, and giving the person the ability to have a say in their experience with you. Okay, we're going to move on to the last section today, which is really related to how we then make sure that we are also taking care of ourselves so that we can be regulated in the context of the encounter. I'm going to bring Alyssa back on.
All right. So we have our little joke here from the Peanuts that we're offering a lot of counseling help, but what happens when the counselor is inundated? So it's important to ask ourselves how we're treated in our work setting. How do we treat ourselves, and how do we treat our coworkers? And we really believe that in order to provide good care for other people, it's really important that we're taken care of. So in some agencies, they do really support their staff's self-care. And so that might mean that they're providing massages for their coworkers, or maybe there's lunch that they provide every so often, or snacks that are available to people in other ways that agencies are supporting self-care. I think it's really important when that's not happening to know that there are small things that we can do to support our own self-care, and we'll talk about that. And it's also helpful sometimes to think about what's getting in the way of our self-care. And we don't have time to do it right now, but I would invite folks to really think just for a couple of minutes about what's getting in the way of your self-care, and is there a plan that you can make to help overcome some of those barriers? Because I think we talk about self-care a lot, and we know that it's really important, but sometimes it actually feels like more of a burden to do self-care and can feel kind of overwhelming. So I'm going to skip this part now for time's sake, but we are going to send out PDFs after, and you can take a look at this. It's a burnout scale, and it helps you. You can see at the bottom there's a little scale, and you can see where you're at in terms of self-care and maybe some changes you might need to do so that you don't burn out. So that can be helpful to do yourself or share with others. And these are also some ideas from Preble Street, from our lead agency in Maine. And I love these ideas because I think it's, again, sometimes really overwhelming to think like, oh, I'm going to go to a yoga class today and go get a spa treatment and go do all of these self-care things. But we can also do small little changes to our spaces that can make an impact on us every day. So making spaces feel more comfortable, maybe adjusting your chair, changing your chair, maybe having a blanket in your office, and some of the things that Naomi spoke to that help the people we work with can also help ourselves. Again, like listening to music, finding what kind of music helps you focus, recognizing maybe when you need to take a break and when taking a break will actually help you be more productive. Personalizing your space, having things that connect you to the bigger picture or to something outside of just your office or your day-to-day life work can be really helpful. So again, there's some good questions that we can ask ourselves in terms of our personal nourishment and how we can make a plan that works for us. So thinking about what makes us feel comfortable. Maybe it's something as small as like a mug that we like, and we can have our favorite mug with our favorite kind of tea at our desk. Thinking about what inspires us, maybe why we do the work we do, and connecting to that. Are there ways that you can feel at home, even at your office? And what do you need in order to do your best work? Also knowing where to turn to, again, if it's a coworker, or maybe seeking your own help or therapist, I think is really important to have that and taking care of ourselves. So knowing where we can turn to if we need some relief. And then noticing if the space is balancing our needs and our clients' needs. So again, I'm going to breeze through some of this for time's sake, but I think it's important when we are making a self-care plan to make it really specific. I think research has actually shown that if you pick a time that you're going to do something, you're more likely to do it than as opposed to saying, oh, I'm just going to take a walk today at some point. And I know for myself, I'll never take that walk unless I say when I'm going to take it and for how long. So again, we'll breeze through this, but these are some examples. And if folks have a moment with some paper in front of them, even to write down today, like, is there one thing that you can do today or a small change that you can make that can promote your own self-care, whether it's taking a walk or just changing the brightness on your computer? And One other last aspect I'll speak to is just having like an accountability self-care partner. I think can be really helpful if you have a coworker that can support you in your self-care and you can support them in their self-care. That might really help to create a plan that's more sustainable. All right, so I know I breezed through that part, and I think we just have 1 minute if folks have any questions that they want. And we do have a question, a comment. All right, Hannah has a comment saying that any music in the background sounds like has been helpful for, or not helpful, sorry, for several survivors in her research reported triggers of music beat because they were exploited in ritual trafficking. So that's a great point. So thank you, Hannah, for mentioning that. Okay, any other questions or any comments from anyone? And you can feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or you can just type in our chat box. All right, it sounds like there are no questions, so thank you all for attending our webinar today. We will send out, like I've mentioned, the PDFs, and this webinar will be posted for those of you who had a hard time hearing or were in and out. We will post this, so you can email me if you want access. It'll be password protected on our webpage, and I can give you that, that password. I'm going to write my email. It's also was on that slide. I'm going to put it in the chat box. But there it is on that slide if you want to reach out to me. So thank you again, and we really appreciate you joining us today.